Talking about hairbreadth escapes from looking over the back fence into eternity, said the man from Kentucky with the applause which has followed the Arkansas drummer's bear story had subsided. Well, it didn't turn my hair white, but time has since. You all know, he continued, that I am a Kentuckian by right and birth, but you not all are aware that I was born and reared within a mile of this very spot in which we now sit. Such is the fact, however, that I am going to tell you happened way back in the 60s. I just grown up as straight and tough as the hickory sapling. We lived at the base of a considerable hill, which rose toward the east and stretched its narrow ridge onward for a mile or two. Not 200 yards from our door, old Isaac Johnson built a modest cabin and brought his family down from Illinois. Dudley, their only boy, was just about my age, although not endowed with like endurance and strength. A warm friendship soon sprung up between us, however, and we spent many hours together in the woods with our rifles. It was near the end of May, I remember. I had been idle for some weeks, and idleness, you know, just as that season breeds restlessness and superabundance. I had often heard that the great Mammoth Cave, a few dozen miles distant, and I become convinced that the geological formation on the hill in the rear of our home indicated that another huge cave might surely exist under the green-turfed mound, for in the valleys which lay at its feet I found numerous sinks from which gurgling brooks usually burst, or from which the warm breath of the internal caverns floated up like the smoke from some mountain wigwam. I soon confided my conjecture to Dud Johnson. We talked the matter over and decided that on the following day we would begin a series of systematic explorations. The succeeding day, which was bright and clear, though unusually warm, found us settling out with all the necessary paraphernalia, candles, matches, and a rope, etc. We had poked around in every crack and cranny, and never noon, having lost all hope, was about to call to Dud, who had wandered off into the little skirt of the wood, when a faint shout reached my ears. I hurried up in the direction from whence the voice seemed to come, and was soon standing on the brink of what appeared to be the mouth of our much sought-after cavern. Away down in the bowels of the earth I could see the yellow flare of Dud's candle, and faintly discern his outline as he bent forward, peering out into the darkness before him. The descent to his position was easy, and filled with joy I was soon beside him. The sweet dampness, the sepulchral stillness, and the constantly trickling drops that fell from the beaded ceiling thrilled me with a strange delight. We soon scrambled down the precipitous ledge on which we stood and began to grope forward, our candles flickering fitfully, as in the danger of being blown out at every step. We had not proceeded 20 paces, however, in the black-winged darkness, when we came upon a solid adamantine wall, barring our way and seemingly ending our journey. However, after looking around for some time, we decided that we could pass under the obstruction just over the brook, which flowed serenely from beneath its firm breast. The place was very narrow, and to accomplish this resolve, we had to get down on our hands and knees in the water. We didn't mind that somehow, and we soon elated to find ourselves in the opening as large as, if not larger than, the first chamber that we had entered, although not nearly as high. From this room we pressed on through a smaller aperture, which gradually assumed the proportion of a passage, dangerously with jutting rocks and dubious windings. On we hurried, following the tortuous stream that ran pure and pellucid through the immense cave, which we assured ourselves must be just ahead. I could never forget the effect of the low, sweet murmuring of the little brook, loudly audible for the very absence of other sounds. We found it terribly warm work crawling over the rough-faced rocks and squeezing through narrow openings. Consequently, we every now and then halted to rest. I can't say how long we had been floundering about in the sand and water. We were still held the course of the stream when a low roaring reached our ears. A waterfall. We had once surmised certain that a miniature but beautiful Niagara was just before us. Gathering new energy, we pushed rapidly forward and had gone about a dozen rods perhaps when the roar, which perceptibly gathered volume, seemed to curiously shift itself to a position immediately overhead. But we did not expect sounds to obey the laws of nature here. After traversing another dozen rods or so, we suddenly noticed that the swelling brook was running muddy and bore a few twigs and dead leaves on its hurrying surface. Strangely enough, we were not in the least alarmed, for we thought it was merely a landslide ahead and concluded to push on toward the goal of our hopes. But as the water grew rapidly deeper and muddier, I suggested that we should halt a moment, and forcing a small stick in the bank just at the water's edge, we watched the rising floods creep up, about, and over it, and an inch perhaps, in over 4 or 5 minutes. Dud looked up at me. "It's raining outside," he said, and his face was as white as a sheet. The horrifying truth burst upon us simultaneously. Our fright was mutual, and our flight precipitous. It was a race for life. We must reach the opening before the stream could fill it and cut off our only exit. All along, as we retreated, I noticed on the low ceilings trash and leaves deposited even in the highest points, bearing this positive evidence that at times the whole cave was completely overflowed. Pell-mell over rocks and water we tore, but hurry as we would, the muddy, angry waters still preceded us, swelling and surging between its narrow banks. Now we came to an unusually low point and found the water about our necks as we stooped to pass along. I was in the lead, and though I set a telling pace, Dud, in his fright, managed to keep up. Those few hundred yards seemed innumerably miles, with the floods swelling behind us as the ominous roar overhead gathering volume. Now and then one of our candles would go out, and we were forced to stop and relight it from the ones that still burned, as our matches were all wet and useless. At last, I stood in the chamber next to the fatal barrier. What a moment of suspense, of dread, I suffered while waiting for Dud to come up. I hastily scanned the walls of this, the highest ceiling available, and my heart sank as I saw the unmistakable signs of overflow on every side and overhead. Dud soon joined me, mud-begrimed and panting. He looked the faint incarnate, dragging himself forth from his home of ooze and filth. But I had not laughed as my terrible gaze rested on his pale and troubled face. You may be sure. I remember feeling a great pity for him, however. Tremblingly, we advanced a few rods and came upon the wall, but no exit was visible. Now it was concealed by a small pool with a swift maelstrom that swallowed with evident gusto those bits of wood and leaf which came near its hungry gullet. Weak and overcome with excitement, we sat down on a little knoll, and with the protruding eyes of a doomed man, watching the steady up-crawling of the stream, so different from the song-whispering brook of an hour ago, the awful silence was oppressive, while the heavy darkness gathered on every side as if to extinguish our feeble lights. Both of our heads were hatless, and a small stream of crimson trickled from Dud's forehead, a wound he had received from a jutting rock on some obstacle overhead. The situation was terrifying. I was almost certain that death was inevitable, but singularly enough, my whole attention was centered on my miserable companion. I gazed steadily at him, wondering what his thoughts might be, and if all his past life was hurrying before him in review, as I had often heard it said men's lives would do when death seemed inevitable. Silently and steadily, like some great yellow serpent, the brook crawled into the narrow chamber and coiled fold on fold. We had already moved back to higher ground once, and now it was inching up about our feet again. Our heads were against the highest part of the rock roof, so it would be better to keep our places than to move back to a more trying position, which would not be safer. To my dying day, I shall never forget the feelings that crept over me as the water stole up along my body, cold and slimy. It seemed that I was being gradually swallowed by some foul monster, The submerged portions of my body seemed severed from the trunk, while sure death enveloped me. A sensation of insufferable closeness almost choked me, while the very helplessness of the situation added 1,000 terrors. Dudley sat as one in a profound stupor, one hand grasping the 2 inches of tallow he had left, his other scraping piteously along the rough wall as though seeking an exit for its petrified owner. For my part, I became strangely quiet after a time, while a sense of indifference possessed me, a sort of resignation to the inevitable, I suppose, for the floods continued to press upward. Our shoulders were now just above the waters, while my hand grew so weary of holding the candle that it seemed as if about to sink below the surface despite my every effort. Neither of us had spoken for some time when Dudley suddenly turned to me. "I can't stand it any longer," he said simply. "Tell them goodbye at home for me, and if you ever get out," and he rose to launch himself forward. I saw his object at once and reached out to grasp him. "Hold on, Dud," I said. "I don't believe it's going to get any higher." "It don't make any difference," he repeated. "We both can't live long in this small place anyhow," and he sank from view. I felt him touch it as he rolled over, and I clutched his body to lift him to the surface, but it escaped my grasp, and the succession of bubbles told me that further effort was useless. He was drowned. His candle had of course gone with him, and I questioned whether it would not be best for me to extinguish my own, since it was fast exhausting the oxygen that was an absolute necessity to my life. But I could not decide to snuff out that feeble light. It was almost like life itself. I cannot describe to you my feelings as I sat 100 feet underground, with only a breathing space of 5 or 6 feet above my head, the water at my chin, and the cold form of my dead companion at my feet. It seemed as if this mental torture lasted for hours, when lo, a great joy seized me. The flood had ceased to rise. But its abatement must be far swifter, or I would perish miserably from mere exhaustion. In a half an hour the water sank so low that I managed to get under the rock, and with loudly beating heart saw once more the bright, sweet light of day. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I found that a tremendous rain had fallen, which accounted for the torrent in the cave. I hurried off to the village as fast as my stiff limbs would carry me, and told my story. A score of men went back with me and recovered the body of my comrade. In that fearful race for life, he had saved mine at the cost of his own. This has been A Race for Life by A.B.D., published in Short Stories, a magazine of select fiction, Volume 13, 1892. Narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.